The 1980s started off with a landsliding presidential election. The election was between Republican Ronald Reagan and Democratic James Carter. Ronald Reagan won by a landslide. He had 489 electoral votes. He became the 40th President of the United States. In the year of 1891, there was an attempted assassination for Ronald Reagan by John Hinckley. James Brady, Reagan's Secretary of State, actually got shot in the head, and Ronald Reagan got shot in the lung. They both were rushed to the hospital, but luckily both survived. In 1983, Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire. After this, he created the Star Wars, which stands for Strategic Defense Initiative. Ronald Reagan was re-elected for a second presidential term. In the year of 1988, Ronald Reagan's vice president, George Bush, ran for presidential election. George Bush won the election. He defeated Michael Dukakis. In the same year, the United States signed a free trade agreement with Canada. In the year of 1983, a new holiday was made. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday was created in November of 1983. It took 15 years to finally make it a holiday. This new holiday was the first new federal holiday since 1948, which was when Memorial Day was created. The First Lady, Nancy Reagan, toured the nation with her Just Say No campaign. In the year of 1988, the Office of National Drug Control Policy was created as part of the Executive Office of the President. They were mainly focused on the treatment, prevention, domestic, law enforcement, and interdiction and international efforts. This was later called the War on Drugs. Ronald Reagan made a tax cut. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 had a 25% reduction in individual tax brackets. During this, the Federal Reserve Board altered monetary policy to bring inflation under control. The inflation went down faster than expected, and so the economy fell into a deep recession in the year of 1982. The Tax Reform Act of 1986 brought the tax rate from 50% to 28%. Ronald Reagan had a theory that was based on the belief that high taxes takes money away from the people and businesses that the economy needs, money that would be spent on investments in factories, equipment, and research. The second aspect of this theory involved cutting federal spending to reduce inflation and cut unnecessary programs.
The 1980s were a great time of economic, social, and general change as the wealth and production in America migrated to newly industrializing economies, but also consisted of a significant time of intellectual development, a worsening economy, and tense international relations.
Social changes in the 1980s included feminist movements, along with the bringing about of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, stimulating the discussion of gay and lesbian rights. The HIV/AIDS epidemic was first recognized by the United States, occurring in a small amounts of gay men. It was thought to have originated somewhere in Africa. America was the first to make the general public aware of this disease, and the reactions of Americans to AIDS definitely contributed in establishing AIDS as one of the most politicized, feared, and controversial diseases in the history of modern medicine. During the 1980s, the Democratic Party openly supported gay rights. They started advocating a new philosophy in which all groups must be protected from discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, language, age, sex, or sexual orientation. The first major party presidential candidate to address a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender organization was Gary Hart. The first same-sex domestic partnerships ordinance was adopted by the city of Berkeley in 1984, in which they recognized households and relationships. In 1982, the Village Voice became the first business to offer domestic partnership benefits. And in 1984, Berkeley became the first U.S. government body to offer gay and lesbian benefits that heterosexual couples once took for granted. The American women's rights movement greatly advanced during the 1980s. In 1984, a financial network for pro-choice Democratic women running for national political office was created. This administration was named Emily's List, standing for Early Money is Like Yeast, and would eventually make a significant impact on the increasing numbers of women elected to Congress. In 1986, the Supreme Court found that sexual harassment was a form of illegal job discrimination through the case of Meritor Savings Bank versus Winson. The developing cultural and social changes of the 1980s definitely marked turning points in art, music, technology, and the way people viewed life in America. Video games, minivans, camcorders, aerobics, and talk shows all began to become integrated in the everyday American life. In 1984, the Motion Picture Association of America, also called the MPAA, introduced the PG-13 movie rating. The MPAA was responsible for creating a rating system for movies. At first, the rating categories consisted of G, M, R, and X. G for all ages, M for mature audiences, but all ages allowed, R for no children under 16 unaccompanied by an adult, and X for no person under 17 years of age. The M category was later changed to PG, which stands for Parental Guidance Suggested, and the age limit of the R rating was raised to 17 years old. The new PG-13 rating that was created indicated film content with high levels of intensity, strong language, and mild bloody violence and drug content, which may or may not be appropriate for children younger than 13. The first PG-13 movie to be released in the theaters was Red Dawn, starring Charlie Sheen and Patrick Swayze. The MTV cable station was created and set the youth of the 1980s on fire. This television station was originally meant to simply promote albums, but eventually had a fantastic impact on young people and on the music industry itself. The invention of the digital compact disc, or CD, transformed the music business as well. Pop, rock, punk, country, new wave, and especially hip-hop and rap became quite popular in the 1980s. Musical artists such as MC Hammer, Madonna, Vanilla Ice, Michael Jackson, and Whitney Houston all became tremendously famous during the course of this decade. Artists, art museums, and art itself were all greatly admired and valued during the 1980s. Some of the most popular artists included Jasper Johns, Keith Haring, and Frank Stella. Fashion trends were inspired by stylish and classy women such as Nancy Reagan and Princess Diana. Nancy Reagan's elegance
Combined with Princess Di's love of fashion, inspired luxurious clothing styles. Madonna, an American singer and songwriter, had a major influence on power dressing and on young fashion.
There was much intellectual development in the 1980s. America was becoming much more technologically advanced, and as a result became more apt to make beneficial discoveries or conduct significant experiments. Much intellectual development took place in the space program. America was involved in the space race with the Soviet Union and sought to stay ahead of them in accomplishments and technology. In 1980, the first American shuttle, Columbia, went into space. In 1983, the first American woman went into space. Her name was Sally Ride. Unfortunately, not all of the space program missions were as successful. In 1985, the shuttle Challenger lifted off, but exploded shortly after takeoff. It was not only a tragedy to the United States, but a demonstration of weakness to the Soviet Union. The 1980s underwent both scientific and technological advancement. In 1981, PC computers were invented for the first time. In 1984, the PG-13 movie rating was created and is still in strong existence today. Two significant discoveries were made in 1985. One was the finding of a hole in the ozone layer. While this was not a good thing, it was beneficial in that it drew much awareness to pollution and protection of the environment. The second discovery was the finding of the Titanic. The great ship had sunk about 70 years before, had finally been located. An important event that occurred in 1982 was that the Vietnam Memorial opened in Washington, D.C. This was essential to remembering and honoring the soldiers that fought and died in the Vietnam War.
El Salvador was an area of extreme unrest. Ronald Reagan and the United States wanted to help El Salvador out. We supplied money, arms, and expertise. President Reagan created SALT, which stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. The goal of this was to stop arms race with the Soviet Union. The outcome was not what was expected. It failed because communism kept spreading to other countries. The Reagan Doctrine was a doctrine that moved away from DNA and human rights and moved towards intervention. The main focus of the Reagan Doctrine was Central America. For the Reagan administration, Nicaragua looked like another Cuba, a communist state that threatened the security of its Central American neighbors. In the year of 1987, the American preoccupation with Nicaragua began to subside. The United States invaded Grenada. The invasion sent a clear message throughout the region that the Reagan administration would not tolerate communism in its hemisphere. Ronald Reagan called the USSR the evil empire. Ronald Reagan created SDI, or as many people call it, Star Wars. This system was meant to protect the United States from any nuclear missile attacks from the Soviet Union. He stationed those defensive objects in outer space. In March of 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet General Secretary. He also created better relationships between the Soviet Union and the United States.
The Cold War finally ended in 1989. The Soviets were tired of the arms race. Both America and the Soviet Union were tired of defending their countries against each other. In 1986, America conducted an airstrike against Libya. The government in Libya had been overthrown, and America wanted to protect the people. In 1988, America shot down an Iranian airliner that was flying over the Persian Gulf because they believed it was an Iranian fighter jet. In 1988, America and Canada decided to sign a free trade agreement. This allowed trade to flow freely between the two countries, and it removed past trade restrictions. As time passed, America's economy worsened slightly, despite attempts to regulate it. The 1980s was not a high point for the national economy. There was a recession in 1982 because the government had been attempting to control high inflation. The inflation came down in 1983, and by 1984 the economy was back on track and growing steadily. In general, the prices of oil were affected because of the growing involvement in the Middle East. In spite of President Reagan's attempts to help the economy, America's national debt virtually tripled during his presidency. He also issued tax cuts and increased military spending. Overall, the federal government spent much money throughout the course of the decade.
In conclusion, the 1980s were a great time of economic, social, and general change as the wealth and production in America migrated to newly industrializing economies, but also consisted of a significant time of intellectual development, a worsening economy, and tense